Great Ananse is the king of our imagination, bringing stories with the light of the ancient Africa. Great Ananse is a griot, a chantuel, a calypsonian. What a wonderful delight is to hear her stories. Like an enormous spider web, she weaves her stories, and the grandpa and the kids, they all love what there's to hear. Great Ananse is the king of our imagination. Ananse is the wonder of creation. Great Ananse is the king of our imagination. Ananse is the wonder of creation.
Splash. I just want to say that it's a beautiful Saturday morning and it's International Men's Day, and Liberty Hall is proud to host the Ananse Sound Splash. Want to welcome Dr. Amina Blackwood Meeks and her organization to Liberty Hall. A nation without knowledge of its past is like a tree without roots. Liberty Hall Legacy of Marcus Garvey perpetrates the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey, and we are here to facilitate events that will perpetuate his legacy, as well as give us the food that we need to build a great nation. And without his philosophy and opinions, I don't think that we would be in good stead to hear, understand, and embrace the lessons that we are about to have, or should I say partake in, from the Ananse Sound Splash. So again, welcome to Liberty Hall and have a wonderful, wonderful event.
A pleasant good morning to all here at Liberty Hall and our live stream audience, and those of us who have joined the Zoom. Welcome to this leg of the Storytelling Conference and Festival, Ananse Goes to Liberty Hall. In these footsteps, Garvey and Male Leadership. A special welcome to Dr. Amina Blackwood Meeks, Festival founder and artistic director. Mr. Stephen Golding, our guest speaker for this morning. Members of the Planning Committee and other specially invited guests. I take this opportunity to also wish our men here at Liberty Hall and those online happy International Men's Day. International Men's Day is celebrated worldwide for the positive value men bring to the world, their families, and communities. The theme for 2022 International Men's Day is helping men and boys. International Men's Day is an opportunity for people everywhere of goodwill to appreciate the men in their lives and the contribution they make to society for the greater good of all. And I would like the ladies here to just give the gentlemen, including myself, a nice little cheer. And thank you. At this time, I'll ask Mr. Paul Morgan to do his welcome.
Pleasant good morning again, everyone. I am Paul Morgan, the groundsman, caretaker. I call myself the beautificator director of Liberty Hall. I've been here for the past 13 years, loving the place. The love for the place helps me to love my job, not to see myself less than anyone doing anything else out there. And I'm happy to say I'm a father who is also a mother within the father itself. I mother my children and I father them by doing the grounds work. This is the first time in my life being a part of an audience or an event which has something to do with men. International's Men's Day. When I was informed about this gathering here by my director, Miss Anya Thompson, I was very elated. I am 44 years of age. Always been a father and a mother to my children. I've never been awarded. I've never been invited. I have never even known that there was an International Men's Day. So this really warms my heart to be a part of this group. I thank you all for being here. Much thanks to you all.
Thank you, Paul, for that. I think I'm going to have to nominate Paul to be the chair of the next Men's Day event at Liberty Hall. So there we have a chair. Hopefully your CEO will accept my nomination. Okay, so this morning we have someone who really needs very little introduction, and we're particularly happy for him to be here to speak to us in these footsteps, Garvey and male leadership. The choice of speaker was a very good choice given Mr. Golding's background and scholarship and activism in Garvey. As you know, Mr. Golding is the president for the UNIA and a well-renowned scholar in Garveyism. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Stephen Golding, who will give his keynote.
Morning, everyone. And those joining us online, I have my notes in my phone, so if I pull for it every now and then, I need it to guide me. But let me say it's a pleasure to be here. Great Garvey Day. It's November 19th. It's International Men's Day. It is the day before November 20. And I know what you think I'm about to say, but November 20 is also known as Black Awareness Day in Brazil. Brazil is a country in the Western Hemisphere with the majority of black people, black citizens, right? So tomorrow they celebrate basically their, not a Black History Month, but their Black Awareness Day. And that day was designated based on the day that one of their national heroes, Zumbi, who was the leader of the Dos Palmares Quilombos, the Maroons of Brazil, died. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that tomorrow is also the start of the World Cup. So I had to find a way to big up my side, Brazil, right? And it's a special day for them. So let's hope that that bodes well by the end of the competition. Keynote speaker, every time I hear those words, they're very intimidating to me, keynote, because I just like to talk. And the reason I love to join my mother, Auntie Amina, there is that, she is our national griot, our storyteller. And I like to tell stories too, stories that are rooted in history, rooted in facts. And so today, I've been charged with really talking about, in the footsteps of Marcus Garvey, and really how his journey helped influence some of our other famous Jamaicans or infamous Jamaicans, however you want to look at it, some of our national leaders, some of our iconic personalities. And so my work and study in terms of the history of Garvey and the UNIA has revealed a lot to me. And so I'm always happy to talk about that. So what I wanted to do today was kind of really, without focusing on Garvey's story, because we are in Liberty Hall, his story is on the walls all around us. And I talk a lot about Garvey's story. I just want to walk with him and show you at various points where his life intersected with some of these people. Some you may have known, some you may not know, and some things you might be surprised to hear, right? So Garvey was born in 1887, as we know. And the backdrop to Garvey being born globally in terms of what was going on for black people, this was a tremendous time. In fact, this is towards the end of the 19th century, and a couple of key things happened in that first decade of Garvey's life. Number one is the concept of Ethiopianism, on which the Garvey movement is very much grounded and founded, which came out of Africa. Pan-Africanism is a creation of Africans who were taken out of Africa, but Ethiopianism, which is rooted in the Christian history of Africa, and the fact that black clergy were being discriminated against. And in 1888, going into 1892, you had leaders of the black clergy coming out of the Methodist Church who, realizing that racism was being practiced within Christianity, decided to do their own study of the Bible and their own study into the history of Christianity in Africa. And out of that, we have the Ethiopian movement. We had African independent churches being born, and we have a spotlight being put on the fact that even though for us in the West, Christianity at times was a tool of enslavement, right? We know even the papal bull, the Pope issued certain things that sort of legalized and sanctified the slave trade. But nonetheless, in the Ethiopianist movement, we found that we also had a history of Christianity in places like Ethiopia that was independent of colonization, independent of chattel slavery in terms of how black people embraced Christianity. So that movement came about around the same time, a few years after Garvey was born, and it spread around the world. It was even set out exponentially by a big occurrence in 1896, right? In 1887, when Garvey was born, there was also in Ethiopia the Battle of Dogali, where Rasalula defeated the first column of Italian soldiers who he had told that they were encroaching a little bit too much in his territory. This battle then spun off and led to the Battle of Adwa 9 years later, 1896, where Ethiopia defeated Italy and crushed their dreams of colonizing their nation, and it reverberated around the world because they became the first African nation to defeat an invading European army, right? And they did it magnificently. And Ethiopia from that time till now has remained uncolonized, unconquered, occupied for a small number of years before World War II, but never conquered, never colonized, right? The Ethiopians do not speak Italian like we speak English, right? So this happens. This adds some impetus to the Ethiopian movement. It makes the Psalm 68:31 almost a sacred text to the Ethiopianist practitioners. Of course, that is now the ritual of the UNIA and the way we begin every one of our meetings by saying, princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God, right? Also around this time, born in Jamaica, 4 years before Garvey, actually, in 1883, is another phenomenal Jamaican whose path would cross with Garvey, both here and later when they were both residents in New York. His name is J.A. Rogers, right? Joel Augustus Rogers, born in Negril. He is considered the father of Negro history. And many of us don't recognize him or even know who he is in Jamaica. You know, we need to build a statue to this man or name a library after him, because he's particularly the person, even before people like Cheikh Anta Diop or people like John Henry Clark, right? This man was publishing his books published his first book in 1917 and several books after that. He spent much of his years traveling to Europe, researching in their own libraries, using their own documentation, much as the Ethiopianist movement progenitors studied the Bible to show that racism or race superiority or race inferiority was not justified by scriptures. Rogers used Europe's own history books to show the greatness of black people that Europeans themselves had researched and found out already. So even this connection between Egypt and Africa, right, which we hear a lot about today because of the propaganda that was done, we had to spend a lot of time reconnecting ourselves with Africa. At one point, the world tried to convince us that the Egyptians weren't even Africans. They weren't black people. You remember this? It was people like Joel Augustus Rogers who made that connection and began to talk of the blackness of the pharaohs and their achievements. And he was doing this before 1920, well over 100 years ago. Some of us who just discovered these things 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, right? Because our curriculum still doesn't incorporate these kinds of historical connections. When you do the research and you find out that you had a Jamaican over 100 years ago saying these things, you know, it just makes us even more proud, understanding that as a people, we little and we tallow are not just on the sporting field, but intellectually and spiritually. And we've always had this yearning and burning desire to reconnect with our ancestral homeland that produced people like J.A. Rogers, produced people like Marcus Garvey. So, Garvey, Rogers, Ethiopianism. Garvey grows up, we know the story, apprentice printer, becomes a master printer after that. He moves from St. Anne's Bay to St. Mary to Kingston, begins to become involved in politics. And the biggest political influence on him at the time, and this is the one person I'm going to mention today, who is not a true-born Jamaican. He's actually born in the Bahamas, but he died in Jamaica and even served as a member of the Legislative Council in Jamaica. His name was Dr. Joseph Robert Love, right? Dr. Love was the publisher of the Jamaican Advocate, but even before coming to Jamaica, he had a distinguished history. He was the first black man to graduate from the School of Medicine at the University of Buffalo, first black man to get a medical degree from that institution. He was also sent to Haiti, where he worked in Port-au-Prince as their chief medical officer for the city. And he worked there at a time where the American representative in Haiti was none other than the great Frederick Douglass. You know, he wasn't given the title of ambassador, he was given the title of consul, maybe because he was a black man, they know him ambassador. But he was living in Haiti representing the United States. And he happened to interact with Dr. Love. Dr. Love was able to build up this network of connections then. And after his job in Haiti, he moved to Jamaica. Now, he moved to Jamaica right around the time that the first Pan-African conference was held in London. And that was held on July 23rd. Some of us know that date, 1900. And it was chaired by a man, a Trinidadian, and his name is flying out of my head right now, but it will soon come back to me. Since he's not a Jamaican, I don't have to go into him too much. But he set up a Pan-African Association. Sylvester Williams was his name. He set up a Pan-African Association, which he then wanted to have chapters of in the various parts of the world where black people were domiciled. This is the same founding impetus of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, to create a global network. Dr. Love came to Jamaica and he decided to set up a chapter of that Pan-African Association. He held several debates. He was pushing Pan-Africanism. And so a young Garvey coming into Kingston at that time was exposed to this very forward thinking, right? Connected to the first Pan-African conference, being pushed by a very reputable man who was not only a medical doctor and a journalist, he also became a chairman of the board for the Woolmer School, and then he later ran as the representative for the parish of St. Andrew and One, becoming the second black man to take a legislative council seat, right? Wasn't Jamaican, but worked for Jamaica, loved Jamaica, and died in Jamaica. So he had a profound influence on Marcus Garvey. Garvey, after the strikes in Kingston, after meeting Dr. Love, after sort of cutting his teeth politically, being exposed to Pan-Africanism, Garvey leaves Jamaica for 2 years and he travels to Costa Rica in 1910. Leaves Costa Rica and goes to Nicaragua, Panama. He gets a view of Central America before coming back to Jamaica 2 years later. But while he's in Costa Rica in 1910, working as a timekeeper on the farm, the following year in 1911, before he leaves to travel to the other countries, a gentleman comes to Costa Rica at the tender age of maybe about 8 or so. And he goes by the name Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert. Anybody recognize that name? Sorry, he wouldn't have been 8. He would have been 20-something, because he was born in 1894. So he would have been a little younger than Garvey, 7 years younger than Garvey, but still a grown man. Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert is one of the founding fathers of the Rastafari movement. We talk a lot about Leonard Howell, but Hibbert also preached independently about the divinity of Haile Selassie. He's the founder of the Ethiopian Coptic faith, and also a charter member for the first EWF charter here in Jamaica. He was living in Costa Rica the same time that Garvey was living, and it is impossible at that time, being a small Jamaican community, that you don't encounter each other. Hibbert, while he's in Costa Rica, is also becomes a member of the an Ethiopian Masonic order, right? A group of black men who are inspired by the Ethiopianist movement. They form an organization for benevolency, for fraternity, and so forth. And so this has an influence on Hibbert and Garvey at the same time, because Garvey would have been engaging with these various organizations towards the improvement and upliftment of black people, right? So here are the paths of two men who later have a great impact on Jamaica. Garveyism is huge. The Rastafari movement is global right now, right? So Garvey is there, Hibbert is there. Garvey leaves before him, returns home, and doesn't stay long before he heads out to England, London, right? But while he's home and before he heads to London, he meets a gentleman by the name of St. William Grant from Brandon Hill in St. Andrew, right? Garvey, by this time, after coming back from Central America now, and even after meeting Dr. Love in Jamaica and working with him, is quite the orator. So he engages in street oratory, he engages in debates, he attends these social functions. You have to understand that as black people, we didn't have a lot of distraction back then, TVs and movies and all of these things. So a lot of our free and social time was put towards trying to figure out how to improve our social standing. So you had a lot of clubs, a lot of debate clubs, a lot of political clubs, constantly agitating. So it is in this arena that Garvey sharpens his skills, right? He heads to London in 1912. He's there for 2 years before returning home. Meets a few people over there. None of them quite Jamaican, so I'm not going to waste any time going into that. Comes back in 1914, the very year that Dr. Love dies. He eulogizes Dr. Love, but by the time he arrives back, he has this grand idea of forming this universal confraternity to galvanize the collective strength of black people everywhere in the world. And he calls it the UNIA and ACL, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. He launches it 5 days after arriving back in Jamaica and begins to go to work. The first idea is to set up a training institution, the likes of the Tuskegee Institute, set up by Booker T. Washington in Alabama in the United States. In fact, he writes to Booker T, says he wants to visit him. By the time he gets to the United States in 1916, though, Booker T is dead. This doesn't deter Garvey. He does a tour of the country. He's there when, in 1917, when black people are massacred in East St. Louis, and it has an impact on him, right? In fact, it is the first time Garvey steps up onto the public stage at the silent protest held by the NAACP in New York. And Garvey begins to address the situation, and people are exposed to the amazing oratory and the powerful words of this man, who wasn't very much inclined to be a silent protester, right? Garvey worked with his words, worked the crowd with his speech. And after this, he decides to stay in the United States to establish the UNIA there. Now, this brings him into touch with a few Jamaicans that I have to mention here. And sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, right? As soon as Garvey begins to make headlines in the United States, there is a group of Jamaicans who write to the Gleaner here to report on his activities abroad, what he's doing, right? And not speaking very nicely, saying, oh, he's up here riling up the people and so forth, and same thing he was doing back down there. And they put their signatures to this letter. Among them are three particular Jamaicans: Wilfred Adolphus Domingo. If you don't know that name, he's the founder of the Jamaica Progressive League that is still active in the United States right now, and became really the support group for the founding of our first, well, not our first political party, but the founding of the People's National Party, right? Another signature to that letter is Father Raphael Morgan, Robert Morgan. Again, I'm dropping names not many Jamaicans know, but why am I mentioning these people? Father Raphael Morgan is the first ordained black Orthodox priest in the West. And he's a little man from Clarendon who traveled all over the world, to Turkey, to Palestine. And in 1905, he was the guest for about 3 months of the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia. This is a man who would have conversed and reasoned with a certain Russian by the name of Rasputin, Gregory Rasputin, right? Imagine the last emperor, Tsar is their term, of Russia, had a Jamaican from Clarendon, the first black Orthodox priest, as his guest in his palace, right? So these are the contemporaries of Marcus Garvey. I don't know what them was putting in the food or the fruit at that time, but whatever Jamaicans were eating at that time, we were reaching places in the world where you wouldn't expect this little dot of an island to be, right? Also, the final signature to that letter was a man by the name of Herbert Simeon Boleyn. Now, if you look on the wall back there, I think you see an advertisement for Black Dolls. Is it this wall or the other wall in the other room? Herbert Boleyn was the president of that company, who went into business with the UNIA, and Garvey took it as a next, political propaganda about advertising and promoting black dolls for black babies, which he's very correct in doing, right? But the man who he partnered with, who he may or may not have known his history, right, was a Jamaican, I forget what parish he's from, who had gone to the United States and who had become one of the first black private detectives working for the Pinkerton Agency. I used to read about the Pinkerton Agencies when I used to read cowboy comic books as a child. They'd always talk about the Pinkertons, right? Who would know that there was a Jamaican Pinkerton detective? He later became an informant for the FBI, known as P-138. But there are people within the Garvey movement who have said to me that Garvey knew very well that this man was an informant, and in fact that Garvey had double agents working for him. So there are people who would come and tell him and say, the FBI approached me, and Garvey would say, all right, work with them. But then he would begin to control the information that would be sent to them. Very intelligent person. Again, another Jamaican. While Garvey is in New York on October 1919, there's an assassination attempt on his life in his office, which is thwarted by his then secretary, Amy Ashwood. He marries her 6 months later. I don't know, men. A woman save your life, you might be inclined to ask her to spend the rest of it with you, right? But what happens after that assassination attempt is that the movement around him realize that he's being targeted, and they feel that we need to organize to protect him. Well, a few months before that, guess who had arrived in New York? His old friend from the streets of Kingston, St. William Grant. St. William Grant, after the assassination attempt, is appointed head of a special division of the UNIA known as the Tiger Division. It consisted entirely of men of military age. And they were trained to handle firearms and so forth. And at all times after October 1919, 6 of them traveled with Marcus Garvey, not in uniforms, but in plain clothes, armed with revolvers in case anybody would try to assassinate Garvey again. So this is where Garvey was by 1920. He's a major leader, political figure, with all the trappings, the cars, the entourage, the security, and the espionage going on around him, right? And that was led, his security detail was under the direct control of St. William Grant. So this would have been a man that Garvey had to trust very much and be absolutely convinced of his loyalty, right? While he's in New York, the UNIA opens up a ice cream. Apart from selling black dolls, there were restaurants, grocery stores, a number of businesses being operated. One of them was a restaurant. And next to that restaurant, there was a gentleman who worked and operated a tea room. Come to turn out, this man was from Crawl in Clarendon, and his name was Leonard Percival Howell, right? And this was a man using certain herbs and leaves and stuff, making different teas and supplying the public, right? Now, we all know Leonard Howell becomes known as the first Rasta, and probably one of the first proponents of the legalization of ganja in Jamaica. So you can see where the history comes back. He's an herbalist, make teas and things like that. He has that experience in New York, but he's not the only Jamaican up there who is into nutrition. There is another man who has just arrived, he says from Spain, some say from Cuba, but he works a little further down, not in Harlem, a little further down in Manhattan, operating as a dietitian, and he goes by the name of Alexander Bustamante. People don't know this, you know. A lot of people don't know Alexander's main trade before he came back home. He was a policeman in Cuba, but when he was in New York, he was known as a dietitian. So he tell you the proper things to eat. And if you follow his speeches, even after he became prime minister, there are a lot of things that indicate that he had, you know, he's a kind of, he would often talk about recommending people eat more lettuce and things like that. Follow his public speeches. Very interesting man. But he's in New York. Howell is in New York, Grant is in New York, Garvey is in New York, Bolin is in New York, Rogers is in New York, Domingo is in New York. So it is a melting pot of these Jamaicans, right? All of them becoming or poised to be giants in their own right, and they happen to occupy the same space and time for a period, right? So living off of each other's, feeding off of each other's energy, whether confrontationally or otherwise. Anyway, we know the story of Garvey. He gets framed for mail fraud. They do that in order to deport him. But before he's deported, he's well established a global organization, right? Incorporating the Ethiopianism that was birthed a few years after he was born. Incorporating various Caribbean and African descendants into an organization, and is still to date the largest mass movement of black people ever founded. He gives us a flag, he gives us an anthem. The anthem people often know is written by Rabbi Arnold Josiah Ford, a Bayesian black Jew. But if you look it up, it also says written by Ford and Burrell. And we often don't pay attention to the Burrell part. But the man who wrote some of that anthem was a man by the name of Benjamin Ebenezer Burrell, comes from Mandeville, Manchester. And much more than just a writer of lyrics, he was a secretary of the UNIA division under Garvey's presidency in New York, and went on to serve in other organizations. So I have to mention him because the Universal Ethiopian Anthem is still being sung today. and he contributed to that, right? Benjamin Ebenezer Burrell, and not to mention contributed to the UNIA in various other ways, right? Also, while Garvey is incarcerated, in 1925, his first editorial, after 3 months in prison, he wrote nothing, but rested. And after 3 months, he produced a document known as the African Fundamentalism. Beautiful thesis, where it says, the time has come for the Negro to forget about and cast behind him his hero worship and adoration of other races, and to start out immediately to create heroes of his own, right? We must canonize our own saints, create our own heroes, and elevate to position of fame and honor black men and women who have made their contribution. In that paragraph, he begins to compare how we know everything about white people and celebrate their history without recognizing our own. So he compares Sojourner Truth, a black abolitionist, to Joan of Arc, saying that, you know, Joan of Arc is considered this big martyr, but there's Sojourner Truth, our own. He then goes on to compare George William Gordon and Crispus Attucks as martyrs, saying they're entitled to the halo of martyrdom with no less glory than that of the martyrs of any other races. I have to bring this point up because he wrote this in 1925. Crispus Attucks is the first man to die in the American Revolution War, and he was a black man in Boston, right? So Garvey isolates that, and what surprises me is that he attaches George William Gordon's name to that too. George William Gordon really was a martyr, because the way they executed him for something that he directly, indirectly never really have nothing to do with, right? They just whoops him out of bed. Him thinks, if you even read the letter George William Gordon writes to his letter, you could tell that he himself didn't even realize they were going to kill him. He was writing like, oh, there's something here, I'll see you soon kind of thing. The next morning he was hung, right? So 40 years before even we had national heroes, and Garvey became our first, and later George William Gordon became one, Garvey himself pointed us to George William Gordon, recognizing his martyrdom. This is in 1925. 1927, Garvey returns home. He's deported. St. William Grant follows him a few years later, and is here by 1929. This is how loyal this man is, right? Garvey comes down here. He gets back to work in reorganizing the UNIA, but he launches a political career now, forming the first modern political party, the People's Political Party. And in their first year, 1929, and this is why I can't understand when we teach our history in Jamaica. You know, for so long, for decades, there's been an effort to kind of besmirch, belittle, or erase Garvey's achievement. But in the first year of 1929, the PPP had 3 victories, right? They put a man in the Legislative Council, Dr. Veach from Hanover, who ran on a PPP campaign because his opponent's political platform was that he was going to eradicate Garveyism from Hanover. You can imagine this? In 1929. And he happened to lose the election. Dr. Veach came into Parliament and remained in the Parliament for a couple terms before joining the JLP after 1962, but he was originally from the PPP. John Coleman Beecher, also won a council seat in 1929, and then Garvey won his council seat in 1929, just before they locked him up for 3 months, and then he won it again in 1930. So oftentimes we say, you know, Garvey founded the PPP, but they didn't make much mileage. We're not doing history justice, right? To start a political party, the first independent political party, because before that, people were sent to the council really who knew the governor and who had connection and who the moneyed people would put their money behind. Garvey launched a party being a black nationalist and had 3 victories in the first year, so it shows you the temperature at the time. This is again is still 33 years before independence, and 15 years before black people could even vote, meaning in general, you had the right to vote just from being a citizen. You know, you had to own property back then. So this is what Garvey does when he comes down. But by 19 1929 also, he establishes the Edelweiss Amusement Park. And this is one of his greatest contributions to our culture. I don't know if people realize. And some of our foundation performers cut their teeth on the stage there. It was at Slipe Road, and he had boxing matches there. He had comedian, you know, like how now you have comedy clubs with people doing stand-up. Him had that going on. He had the first soda fountain in the city brought in from New York there. He put on plays, some of which he wrote himself. He had a dancing troupe known as the UNIA Follies, much like the Broadway Ziegfeld ladies, you know, the ones who come and they do the, all of that was going on. So Garvey really used his experience, his world experience, and tried to bring a certain level of upgrades to the entertainment history here. And it is on that stage that Jamaica got to know the likes of people like Kid Harold, Bim and Bam, and our own Master Ranny Williams was a young man, cut his teeth on the stage at Edelweiss Park. So this is the kind of influence Garvey had as he made his journey. He was a global figure, but he had an impact not only on the world, but on Jamaicans around him. And his energy, the exposure that he brought, the connections that he made, helped, I think, to shape the way these people thought and the way they lived their lives, so much so that they became giants in their own right at some point, right? Now, Garvey went into exile from Jamaica in 1935 after a witch hunt which really was connected to the colonial secretary at the time. You know who our colonial secretary was at that time? This is the man in the British Parliament with the portfolio, the ministerial portfolio for looking about the colonies. Was a young politician at the time, but his name was Winston Churchill. And he would later become a prime minister, right? But he instructed that Garvey's mail should be open, monies being sent to him should be taken out. You know, he had judges going against Garvey for all kind of reasons. Garvey couldn't take the legal harassment and eventually decided that he was going to go into exile after losing some court cases. Some of these court cases were prosecuted by a young barrister by the name of Norman Washington Manley, right? And there's a funny story talking about how one time in the middle of whatever legal battle was going on, Norman Manley refers to the flag of the UNIA as a dirty cloth. And Garvey tells him that we should step outside, you know? And before they go outside, a man whispered to Garvey and say, yo, this man is a boxing champ from, you know, Norman Manley was a young boxer at JC. And Garvey kind of diffused it and they didn't end up going outside, you know, because Garvey never liked embarrassment. But listen, don't get it wrong. Garvey was a man used to fisticuffs himself, you know, known for knocking out the captain of the Black Star Line on one journey when he felt he was sabotaging the journey, right? But I'm showing you, Norman Manley later becomes a national hero. So he had his own run-ins with Garvey, whether he was just doing his job as a barrister or whether he had any anti-Garvey views. I'll leave that to you to interpret. But they cross paths and had an impact on each other. Just as Bustamante was in New York to see what Garvey did, and when Bustamante returned home, he followed a projected path that, if you look at it, was very similar to the way Garvey operated. He came down, he began operating as a journalist, writing letters. When he got into the labor movement, which is something that Garvey started himself, because not only did Garvey form the first political party, but he also was one of the first to begin to organize a labor union. We know this history, right? Right. The same team he used for the PPP formed a workers and tradesmen, I forget the exact name, but you guys can look it up, and laborers association. This is before the BITU. So oftentimes people credit Bustamante for this labor movement. It's simply because we forget that before the BITU and the PNP, there was the PPP and the Workers and Tradesmen and Laborers Association. So even in that, you see Garvey's influence. If you look at the way the BITU was structured, even down to their girl and boys brigade in the early days, all of that was taken from the blueprint of the UNIA. right? And let's not forget that the man who got the crowd to begin to listen to Alexander Bustamante was the same St. William Grant who spent so many years protecting Garvey and promoting the UNIA. After Garvey went into exile, Grant put his energies behind Alexander Bustamante, which then led to the big labor movements, then led to the political parties, then led to adult suffrage, then led to independence. So Garvey's footsteps are there all the way, right? And he carried many of them for a time and then allowed them to continue the journey, right? And I can't end without recognizing the impact that Garvey's footsteps had on this gentleman here. The Honorable Robert Nestor Marley, known to the world as Bob Marley, right? They call him the Tough Gong in recognition of the first gong, Leonard Howell, again, a man in Garvey's footstep. But Bob Marley, much of his lyrics and his songs are eternal, right? But I once did a presentation, I'm not going to get in it today, about just how much of Bob Marley's lyrics came from his readings of Marcus Garvey. The easy ones to remember are Redemption Song, Emancipate Yourself from Mental Slavery, that's on the plaque on that wall over there. But there's also Man to Man is So Unjust, Until We Know Not Whom to Trust. That's not the song, you know, that's the poem Garvey wrote. And it's entitled Man to Man. Bob says Man to Man is so unjust until we know not, yeah, how you go? We don't know who to trust, right? Who the cap fit. And there are others, right? Burning Spear, not so much the words of Garvey, but the memory of Garvey. So even reggae music, you could not have reggae music without Garveyism, right? Remember, Garvey was 50 years, 40 years, 30 years before the Black Power movement. And between the time that Garvey died and the Black Power movement re-emerged in the mid-60s, right? It's almost as if the world wanted to forget about Garvey. So this is why we give thanks to reggae music, which really came about in the same era as the Black Power movement. There was a rise in the consciousness of black people. Because for whatever reason in the 40s and the 50s, maybe it was World War II, had us distracted and the world was rebuilding, and so we sort of forgot about our worries for a while and put our shoulder to the wheel, Windrush generation or whatever. But by the 60s now, we began to become dissatisfied again and began to organize ourselves in a more militant way than before. So the Black Panther Party, the 10-point program, all of that has its roots in Garvey's footsteps and his teachings. The red, black, and green flag became popular again during that era. Reggae music emerged out of that era. Out of reggae music came hip-hop later out of that era. This form of using the arts to express ourselves politically and otherwise, all of that is rooted in the kind of things that Garvey did at Edelweiss Park and at Liberty Hall and at various other places in the world. So this is how it all connects. One powerful Jamaican with his shadow touching a number of other powerful Jamaicans, and find ourselves where we are right now today in Liberty Hall, the legacy of Marcus Garvey, speaking about the legacy of Marcus Garvey and his impact that still lives on. We have the Royal African Soldiers here, right? Their very name comes from one of the legions, right? And their action, their word, sound, power is rooted in that same level of consciousness and using the arts to bring attention to the world and to lift the consciousness of black people. So I'll end there because I know you're going to hear more from them. Thanks for having me this morning.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that very informative presentation. And I think one of the things that we can leave here today is to to note very well in your closing when you made mention of Garvey being almost like a touchstone, a cornerstone, by leaving his footsteps on several things that we have in today's society, our political ideologies, our leaders, in terms of our music, our cultural heritage, and those are legacies that continue not only in Jamaica and the Caribbean, but in the world. That is very, very, very rich. I was busy introducing several other persons, and I'm reminded that I didn't get the opportunity to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kina Senior from the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts. Now, I know that Stephen's presentation struck a lot of chords, and we, as we listened to the presentation, we heard one thing that came out, and that was leadership. Leadership throughout what he did. Leadership and partnership, collaboration, networking. And so when we talk about leadership, what leadership is very heavily attributed to one of the tenets of masculinities. And on today's, where we're celebrating Men's Day, we highlight leadership as one of the attributes of masculinities. And leadership is not an uncommon attribute that we as Jamaicans, Caribbean persons assign to masculinities. Leadership as a concept has been examined by several persons, and we see how leadership connects the dots from the political, the social, the cultural spaces. While listening to Golden's presentation, I'm reminded that Garvey used his leadership to address the matter of equality, especially among blacks and whites. It is evident that Garvey was obviously concerned about unfairness and on the subordination of black people and whites being inferior to blacks, and several things in which he was able to expound on his work through the UNIA and the establishment of other organizations. But perhaps I'm thinking it is time for us to examine Marcus Garvey and his work and leadership in general within establishing something of the sort of a leadership methodology framework that could be used to anchor all of what Stephen would have said in his presentation. And if we should develop one such leadership methodology framework, what would that be? And obviously, what are the tenets? What would that look like? So while listening to Stephen, I'm thinking to myself, okay, so how do we formulate this sort of framework? So one thing came to mind was to have some tenets. And the first tenet of this leadership methodologic framework could be a leader who goes to any measure to ensure that people's highest priority needs are being served. And Marcus Garvey embodied that. He was a man of his word. Stephen said that in his presentation. And he was true to his word. He was able to develop a sense of pride in black people, dignity, and self-esteem. So the second tenet I'm thinking of, and it came out in Stephen's presentation as I listened to him and tried to draw the connecting dots, is the ability to take the initiative or initiatives in general as a pattern for others to follow in one's footsteps. Marcus, you saw that in Stephen's presentation where he was clear in terms of situating what the footsteps that Marcus went ahead, laid, and others followed. The third tenet is one that proposes that a servant leader must be one who promotes a goal that captures the imagination of others and thereby compels and propels them into committed and convicted actions. Not much without a dream can we achieve this. And we see where Marcus was not only a visionary, but he dreamt big. You're talking about the establishment of the UNIA. Stephen mentioned in his presentation the design of the flag and the composition of several organizations that were used to promote people of African descent. The fourth rather, is Garvey's capacity to listen. In him formulating all these various organizations, he had to listen to what were the concerns, so that when he established these organizations such as the UNIA, they were fulfilling the needs of the people. So sometimes we as people, we have to listen before we start to address the needs of people, because sometimes they're not necessarily the needs of the people, but sometimes the inner voices of our own selves that we are addressing. Marcus, and the other tenet is the articulation of a vision. He was clear in his articulation of a vision. And so today, I just want to leave those tenets that I was able to pull out from Stephen's presentation that could guide us in terms of establishing Garvey, and as we follow in Garvey's footsteps and Garvey as a man, and looking at leadership and how we can situate these tenets not only for men, because women are also leaders, but establish this within a framework that caters to both men and women. So I'm going to just open the floor for a few questions, and I'm thinking, Stephen, we could take 2 questions and then you respond. All right, so I'm seeing a hand at the back from the festival organizer and founder, Dr. Amina Blackwood Meeks. You want to come to use the mic so that we can get the best quality?
Stephen, thank you so much for that awesome feast of a presentation. And thank you for allowing this space for the women to intervene on International Men's Day. I want to congratulate you too on proposing this framework for leadership. And perhaps it is something that the organization in Tukuma, along with UNIA, could look at as a project to collaborate on. I have a practical question for you, though. I was intrigued by the way you said that at that time, Marcus Garvey and his generation didn't have the distractions that we now have, and therefore were able to engage in discussions. Give us a solution.
Wow. All right. You know, on one hand, I often say, imagine what Garvey would be doing if he lived at a time when you had social media and internet and all of these things, given what he was able to accomplish without it. But I think the downside of the information age that we live in is that, you know, we get used to a certain rhythm or a certain pattern or a certain frequency where, you know, everything is at our fingertips and we believe that everything must come now. So I find that this generation is very difficult to mobilize, you know, the way you would have done a generation or two ago. Even if I mentioned the Black Power movement, right? You know, during that era, students were ready to be mobilized. They were ready to agitate. But right now it's more like, you know, if we just want to post something and send something and then read the comments. You know, if you try to get something going where you tell a couple of people, let's organize to go march here or do this, that time seems to have passed. I know Auntie Amina asks, what is the solution? I think we're going to have to find a balance and a way to make the technology complement and work with what needs to be done. I mean, just the very way we're meeting right now, we're not a large group here, but we're going out to a larger audience because of that technology, right? But it can't stop with just the absorbing of information. We need to find the technological complement to, once we have provided the information now, how do we implement it and make it, put it to use and make it work, right? And that's not, the solution is not necessarily, oh, well, let's do an online petition, right? How do we use the technology to get people to mobilize and so forth? And it happens in some way. We have a huge entertainment industry in Jamaica. People come out for entertainment. They make the effort to go out for entertainment. And social media is just a way of complementing and promoting that in the industry. I think the same can be done for the social, political, economic changes we want to advocate for. But it's finding the right team and finding the right message and frequency that resonates with the people and motivates them to action. So that is often why I say, you know, we could use a Marcus Garvey in this time, because I wonder how, if he could, without telephone, without even telephone, right? Not even getting to internet and computer. If he could mobilize millions around the world, if he was here today right now, what would he be doing with the telephone and with the internet and so forth? And how much further would he get? Because everything that he did, the majority of his work was done in 5 years, you know. The real rise of the UNIA, all of that happened between, say, 1918 or 1919 and 1923 and 1924, because by 25, he was in jail. So I'm still searching for it. We're still experimenting. But I think also it's a matter of the social evolution. I do not think we are as hungry or as angry, are those the right words? I don't know, as generations before us. And some of that is because of what generations before us were able to accomplish. You know, so it's like, you know, I was telling my two children the other day, we were going to school in the car, and sometimes I just like, you know, they complain about this or that, or daddy this or that, or that. So I went into my real old, I started to tell them stories that my parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts used to say. And I said, you know, you guys really take a lot of things for granted, you know. I said, I used to hear about the elders when them have to get up, go bush, go take cow out to pasture, milk cow, walk back, get ready. Then them tell you, say them walk 20 miles, go school barefoot. Right, them always have the story. Finish school, come back, tend to the field before coming home, and then do them homework by kerosene lamp. Right? I had to tell them that story because I was really saying, you know, you guys complain, but you don't put your mind into how hard it was a generation before. And if they could do it, what you really complaining about, and you have all of this? So that happens, you know what I mean? Each generation will forget and take for granted. So part of motivating them is also for that history not to be lost, and the real appreciation of that history, because I use that to motivate myself, you know, myself. Even sometimes when I feel like I'm tired or I should complain, I think about those stories the elders used to tell me and say, boy, I mean, I have to get up and milk no cow, you know. I mean, I have to walk 20 miles, go to class with no shoes. So really, let me get myself together and get moving. I can do this. This is not hard. You know, I had that experience, so that's what I was trying to accomplish with them. So maybe it's the same thing on a mass scale, you know? We take things for granted, we want it too easy, and we're losing our capacity to put our shoulder to the wheel and struggle and push through when we must. So keep the stories alive so that history is not forgotten, and the impact of it will help to motivate us to get things done. That's my...
Okay, thank you for your response. And while the members, there are some gentlemen in the here at Liberty Hall who will be sharing with us shortly some quotes, famous quotes by Marcus Garvey. But while we wait for that, I'll take about 2 more questions. 1 more question. Okay. Can you use the mic so that for recording purposes?
It kind of leads on from the last thing you were speaking about. We've got you spoke about the fact that you had Marcus Garvey and all his contemporaries, and they were all doing these amazing things, and some of them were coming from like parishes, like rural parts, and they were all doing these amazing things, but they were all relying on each other and really connecting with each other and building with each other and thinking to our point about masculinity. What do you think we can learn from them as a generation, not just the fact that they went through hardship and didn't have the distraction of social media, but what else can we actually take from them as a positive that we can then apply to us now to help us build as men and as communities?
Thank you for that question. And well placed for International Men's Day. I got to tell you something. I'm a big critic of our men nowadays, or manhood nowadays. Not only as an educator where I'm seeing it, you know. Let me go back to my own son, because he's about to take PEP next year, and you know he's in grade 5. He's heading to secondary level, and he was telling me the schools that he's considering. You know, my son is a big footballer, so I want to go to schools that, you know, have big football teams. Now, some of these schools that have big football teams, they're all male. It's an all-male institution. And I was saying to him, I'm not really feeling the all-male institution thing for you for 5 years, right? And I'm not saying this, I know, I used to make jokes, people would call it homophobic when I was younger about all-boys schools, right? But that's not where I'm coming from. Where I'm coming from is the fact that as an educator, the women, the females are far outpacing the men. I see it in the schools. So much so that by the time you get to the tertiary institutions, you're seeing 70, 75, 80% majority females over the males. So I was saying to him, listen, I'm behind you with the football, but we can't leave the academics out either. And I am not comfortable with you spending 5 years only academically challenging yourself against other males. Because the trend is that the women are, you understand? So I can't lock you into that for 5 years because iron have to sharpen iron. So if you're in a school where, you know, it's all males and they're already not performing, then I feel like I'm locking you in. You might be the best, but you're still not getting the iron to sharpen the iron there. So that was my argument to try and convince him to, you know, go for a co-ed school. Where am I coming from with that? Right? I think collectively, that issue of brotherhood and fraternity that Marcus Garvey spoke about, and the way you said they were helping each other, is something that's missing in the society today. Whether it's because we are based on a capitalistic, competitive sort of culture, somehow we have lost our way, right? And so the same way that Garvey saw that the only way as a race we could catch up, because we were, for whatever reasons, whether it was planned or designed or not, we were behind. We were behind socially, we were behind economically, we were behind politically. He wanted us to leapfrog, and the only way you can leapfrog is together. Now, one man can't make them big jump there. Everybody have to come together, and we use the collective muscle, and you get that bounce. I think that is what is necessary for the males, right? I'm not saying that that has to exclude females, but somewhere along the way, you know, I hear them talk about toxic masculinity, and they come up with all these kind of phrases nowadays for whatever reason, right? But we have to help each other advance. We have to help each other excel. And we cannot look at it as I use this example all the time, even in communities when I talk about setting up a business. Like, a one man starts sell some bag juice and he's doing well and he's making some money. What him brethren do in response? Him come and him start sell some bag juice too. And I said, while you might think that is the solution, that is actually hurting because you are selling the bag juice in the same community. So now you're cutting his market in half. You're forced to compete with him. I said, that's not the way to go. What you should have done is knock heads with him and see how we can expand this one bag juice business together. So either I'm going to go take another territory, or we're going to say now, how can we, instead of buying this and mixing it, how we can buy bigger bulk, right? The Chinese do it all the time. Other people do it all the time. And I find that that mentality is missing amongst us because we put more emphasis on competing and not trusting each other, or what Jamaican people call bad minding each other. So you watch how much money Ima make, and you want to make as much money. Various little things. We don't have that. And Garvey speaks about it in his School of African Philosophy too. He says black people always want to start business at the top. You always want to start up here. You're not willing to start here and work up there. Worse, you're not willing to start here together and work up here together. So that's important. We need to reinfuse back in the culture. And this is part of the mechanism of how we teach Garveyism. Like at the primary level when I teach Garveyism, I don't give individual assignments. It's always group assignments. You have to understand that you need your brother beside you. You understand? Don't think of it that I'm not saying you can't go it on your own, and it's not a discredit, but you can go further together. Right? And I think that is what's important for us to learn. And one of the solutions for us bringing our levels back up so we're not falling apart. 20% in the universities. I hear people talking about gender equality, but I'm saying within a generation, we're going to have to start talking about some affirmative action for men.
I'm so sorry. I need to acknowledge the people in this room. Can't read all of the questions, but one seems particularly important. Someone wants to know what kind of childhood Garvey had and how did that impact what he became.
You have to come down to Liberty Hall and read the walls. Yes. Garvey had an interesting childhood. I mean, apart from the fact that his mother and father had several children before him who they lost, and the fact that only he and his sister and I think maybe one other survived. Garvey, in his own autobiography, writes about his childhood and his interactions with his white neighbor's daughter, and how when they decided to separate them, that is how the first time the racism of the world was exposed to him. He talks about, going to swim down at St. Anne's Bay, down at the beach, and how one of his friends, one of his peers, got drowned while he went swimming, and later they found the body partially eaten by sharks. He had a normal childhood like any other Jamaican. But the way he writes and speaks about his childhood, he shows you the impact of when it dawns on us that we are black and that something is not right with how the world treats black people. And it mirrors my own experience, because it wasn't until I left Jamaica that the full impact of racism when I moved to America hit me, and just in little ways, like one of the most impactful events for me was walking on a campus down a pathway once where a white woman and her little daughter were approaching. And it's a big enough pathway, and we were supposed to cross each other. And a few feet before they were to cross me, the woman took her daughter and made a beeline onto the grass, which, nobody walks on the grass. You walk on the pathway. And so I continued, and something just told me to stop and look back. So I stopped and looked back. And certainly she made a circle and came back on the path and continued walking, which obviously was for whatever reason she did not want to walk past. I didn't know this woman. I didn't know her from nowhere. But it stopped me in my tracks for minutes because I had never experienced nothing like that in Jamaica before, right? And I was like, what? I'm like, what? And then it dawned on me, simply because I was a black person. and for whatever reason they were uncomfortable. So Garvey talks about that, and it's the reason why in his travels his eyes were open and he chose the career that he chose to motivate for people, because he said when he went to Central America, he saw things weren't right. When he went to Europe, he saw things weren't right. He read about things in America and saw that they weren't right. And when he went there himself, and so he realized there was nothing else for him to do but try to correct this imbalance in the world. And I felt the same calling myself. So, you know, in Jamaica, we grow in a certain way. We are majority of African descent, but we handle minorities very well. I'm from Old Harbor. I grew up playing with Chinese Jamaicans, Indian Jamaicans, who seen them in school, seen them on the street. We never felt any way. We don't have, you know, but that doesn't change the fact that the world mentality still prevails because of our particular people history as Africans, because of the institutionalization of slavery, and because of the creation of white supremacy, which still lingers in the minds of many black people today, whether they admit it or not.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that response. I'm going to invite the persons who have quotes to say, to come to this mic now, or poems. In the interim, I'll just remind you that we are the festival and conference will continue tomorrow, and we will have at 2 p.m. at the, trying to find my notes, and as I search, that's right, St. Anne Parish Library. Okay, right. So it's at St. Anne Parish Library at 2 o'clock, and then we will go where the curtain comes down at Island Village at 4 p.m. So those are the activities on for tomorrow.
A people without the knowledge of their past history and culture is like a tree without root. Marcus Garvey.
We are living in a civilization that is highly developed. We are living in a world that is scientifically arranged, in which everything done by those who control is done through system, proper management, proper organization, and among some of the organized methods used to control the world is the thing known and called propaganda.
Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.
Up, you mighty race, we can accomplish what we will, Rastafari.
Thank you, and thank you. And then we have another question from Zoom. Could you read it for us, Dr. Mead? Okay, we go to a performance from Zoom.
be brave. Never be a slave from the cradle to the grave. That's just my ways. Still the fire blaze. Hotter than a gauge. Clear the stage. Make way for the prophets of rage.
Marcus Garvey say, in the cause of Africa's redemption, we got to be soldiers. We got to be royal African soldiers. On the battlefield, use the words at your shield. Cut and clear, tell, Rome beware, cause we don't know and well prepared. As a revolutionary, you got to be a visionary, got to be crucial, yet not brutal. Use your wisdom, speak with wise tongue, give the knowledge to the life of the young.
So we got to be brave, never be a slave from the cradle to the grave. That's just my ways. To the fire blaze, hotter than the cage, make way for the prey, for the prophets of rage. Got to be brave, never be a slave from the cradle to the grave. That's just my ways. To the fire blaze, hotter than the cage, make way for the prey, for the prophets of rage.
Yo, I will fight guerrilla warfare like a maroon. Anytime I'll take on your platoon. Hide in the trees, ambush you at noon. See the caramanti, you know it's doom. And the horizon tragedy looms. Slow singing flower bringing over the tombs. Cleaning up the mess with the mops and the brooms. Then we will be back in the month of June. I kill Romans like I'm Spartacus. Fighting the armies of Pompey and Cassius. Yes, I'm greater than Hannibal and Julius. That's why I'm afraid of us. That's why them talk of us. I am a soldier. Write the Constitution. New nation, Haitian revolution. Bookman said it's the only solution. Got to get rid of the Western pollution. The French, American indoctrination. All the British know is to rule by division. So black people, make a decision. We are royal Africans, got to be brave. Never be a slave from the cradle to the grave. That's just my ways. Still the fire.
Hotter than the cage, make way for the prey, for the prophets of rage. Mama, I pray for you, Evans, dear for you. No Sabbath things, no Sabbath things, no Sabbath things. Really went this way for you. Times that's a stray for you, Clyde's that's a grave for you. Nevertheless, don't stress. This man go save you. Give about the francs and the World Bank and let the ladder, let the lamb says the chant as the chant. Power of the sun, Louverture, royal African soldiers. You got to be brave, never be a slave from the cradle to the grave. That's just my praise. So the fire blaze, hotter than the cage, make way for the prey, for the prophets of rage. Royal African soldiers.
Without confidence, you're twice defeated in the race of life. But with confidence, you have won before you have even started. Let me take you into the halls of Timbuktu, when the teachers were you and the scholars were you. We mapped out the stars, knew when the comets flew, traveling the 7 seas on a rendezvous. Way before Marco Polo and his crew even knew the sky made the sea blue. Before they found out the world was not flat, we were building pyramids and practicing Mahat, using compasses and sketching out maps, walking valleys and climbing snow caps when white guys were in caves taking naps. We were throwing dice, we were playing craps, reciting poetry and spitting out raps with a graceful bow as the audience claps. Back in the days when we praise our men raw. Back in the days when we raised by the law, showing respect to our ma and our pa, saying good morning to elders we saw. Before Genghis Khan was taking lands, before Farrakhan was preaching Islam. As-salam, you alaykum. We were saying peace unto you, brother man. So why enslave my people and take my land? Take my treasures, put them in Buckingham, in Vatican and Smithsonian. Told me I had no civilization when Ananse the king of this creation. We were going to space before they went to the moon. Living in castles with 1,000 rooms. By the river Nile waiting for a monsoon. The banks will overflow and the flowers will bloom. Harvest the crops April, May, June. Bury our pharaohs in golden tombs. And if you own this tomb, your life will end soon like a curse from King Tut or Habshed. So come follow me back into the past. Into the pyramids where spells are cast. Where the pharaoh's treasures are great and vast. Hieroglyphics on the wall.
Everlasting.
I went and I took up a mask. Asked master,
my task.
Hold a meditation and I hold my fast and I hope one day to find my
Right.
hunger and my desires, control my wrath.
Right.
Jump in at the night, take a spiritual bath.
Right.
Cause my master has the eyes of the heart. See if I'm wise or just plain smart. I must be humble to develop my art. From the book of the dead, I will never depart. Know all the ways from the end to the start. Read my books, watch people's penny their motives. They could be lurking around on the low down, but I know they're coming because I hear the drum sound from deep into the jungle where the tigers live. Where yin and yang meet and will live positive. Where yin and yang meet and will live positive. So without confidence, you're twice defeated in the race of life. But with confidence, we have won before we have even started.
I'm a hero, if you never know. Took a little time, it's now I show I'm a hero. If you ask, I bow. Can't stop the vibes and flow, yo. I'm a hero, if you never know. Took a little time, it's now I show I'm a hero. If you ask, I bow. Can't stop the vibes and flow, yo. They talk like me, enter the matrix. I am the one, so no replacement. I'm scared to the CIA agents. Higher than the sky, than the basement. Piece of ass. How the case when piece of ass. If it is weak when work hard, have patience, and the line that now put the exclamations. I'm a hero, if you never know. Took a little time, it's now I show I'm a hero. If you ask, I bow. Can't stop the vibes and flow, yo. I'm a hero, if you never know. Took a little time, it's now I show I'm a hero. If you ask, I bow. Can't stop the vibes and flow, yo. Mr. Miss E. A scot-free. Babylon can't stop me. Serious is cancer, looking for the answer. Like a black panther. Meaning an avenger, more than Rodney, I still remember. Russell fence and defense them, I'm ghost fender. Got the ghost father, most coast father. Most coast ass, low laugher. Then start a man, start the fam from the vultures, kind of culture. I'm the ultra, born in the birdness, summer. Hero, if you never know. Took a little time, it's now I show I'm a hero. What's the name of toe? No, nas to blow. Yo.
I. Her Majesty's prison. Too much of us spend the best of us in Her Majesty's prison. Them sell with cocaine for the straw with brains, guns and knife. Come visit with life, take it away, but still spend the most of the day in Her Majesty's prison. Fatherless youths, obvious say, nothing now go on at Jamaica. Most of us have to blame the Prime Minister. Education is a key, but cannot be access free at a cost not affordable to the poor. Door. But if in your thoughts education is that expensive, then give ignorance the blind. Me say too much of us are behind bars. Too much of us end up with scars. Me feel like I'm ready for a vacation and don't return from Mars. Because the earth I run too bitter. Me say too much of us are in Her Majesty's prison. If you're white, you're right. If you're brown, stick around. But if you're black, come forward and face the fact that we need to uplift the standard of we color black with black philosophies, ideas, medias, and black images on our walls. We need our black kings to equalize to a black queen so we can intervene and divert our future from the dungeons of the queen. Seen, too much of us are in Her Majesty's prison. Too much of us are behind bars. Long time we have been asleep. Years we should have risen and think for ourselves, creating our thoughts, ways and means to divert our future from the gates of Her Majesty's prison.
Prison. Wow. So for all the revolutionaries, beware. Conspiracy, assassination, plot. For the black leaders who talking a lot, silence your voice with a single gunshot. The trail gone cold before it get hot. Martial law, every car gets stopped. Pon every corner, a soldier and a cop. People protesting to burn every shop. Cause them killing off the profits and stealing the crops. They want to keep you down lock. If you sound like Tupac, strip you off your dignity and the solitary block. So when they let you out your way is nothing but a mock. Send you to Jamaica to survive on the rock. You're off a militant in the land of the black. We're born all smokers of crack. Empress by my side, righteous rebels watch my back. For any time the secret agents come to attack, cause the CIA heard all the words on your track, and it might give knowledge to the man in the shack. And they don't want that. They can't have that. They don't want that. And them not see that. Because them ready to shoot you down like Lee Harvey. Anyhow, you sound just like Bob Marley. Ready to shoot you down like Lee Harvey. Anyhow, you sound just like Marcus Garvey. Ready to shoot you down like Lee Harvey. Anyhow, you sound like Bob Marley. Ready to shoot you down like Lee Harvey. Anyhow, you sound like Marcus Garvey.
I and I generation will make the change. To predict the future, you have to create it now. More while me just sit down and stretch my imagination. Trying to see the future of this generation. Generation of African that was stolen from the motherland into captive on these plantations. Jamaica, the island, the kings and queens were left on, rising as a peak in the Caribbean. Reggae beat and dancehall bring back the oral tradition, artistic poetry and word sound. Make a more understand, say, the future belong to I and I generation. My generation will make that change. The challenge is upon this generation to conquer the residues of Henry Morgan. The power is given to I and I generation to use them opinion and change the situation. Mind control what they foretold our ancestors into captive. Now this generation come to show you how to live up your mighty race. Marcus Garvey said that many years, pyramids decoded, mental reloaded, information exploded. Black man stand with black woman in this generation. Revolution time. Get the words in momentum. Too much I will sit down. Too much labatong. Honor yourself. Make your will be done. I and I generation will make that change to come. Lee Harvey, and you all your soul just
Bob Marley.
them ready to shoot it down like Lee Harvey.
Anyhow, you sound just like Marcus Garvey.
Them ready to shoot it down like Lee Harvey. Anyhow you sound like
Bob Marley.
them ready to shoot it down like Lee Harvey. Anyhow you sound just
Marcus Garvey.
Royal African soldiers for life.
They say all good things must come to an end, but what we can say about this morning is that it was awesome, and it would not have been possible without some key individuals. Miss Thompson from Liberty Hall, Royal African Soldiers, our keynote speaker, Mr. Stephen Golding, our founder of the Story Festival, Dr. Amina Blackwood Meeks, Paul Morgan, Mr. Kelly from King Alarm, and Mr. Deal from King Alarm, and all the volunteers this morning, persons also from JCDC. I wish and thank you so much for making this day a very, very, very successful one. And please remember that the festival continues tomorrow at 2 p.m. Thank you and all the best. Have a good day.
Great Ananse is the king of our imagination, bringing stars